All right, so we're continuing our look at the prophetic developments in our world that are happening right now. I believe are connected with the antitypical blowing of the sixth trumpet. And we're especially just at this time focusing in on all of the things that are happening in the mainstream media, not only that are being reported about what is actually happening in our world, but the way in which it's being reported that is purposely being done so in a way to try to massage and control how we view what's happening in the world. Because what's actually reported in the news is not also always what is actually happening, but it's what they want you to think is happening.
Hmm.
And so, and in fact, I think far more of what is reported is along the lines of the latter, of them attempting to condition us to see things in a certain way rather than reporting things the way they really are. And often, how things are reported, or the things that they choose to report and the things that they choose not to report, are actually a way for the powers that be to try to control how the masses think and to also steer them and corral people into thinking and behaving in a certain way that ultimately is in rebellion against God and his law.
Before you start, Brother Craig, can I ask you a silly question? But haven't they been doing that since I was a kid? They've been doing that to a smaller degree or a different degree. But hasn't the government always been doing that in some degree in regards to something or another since I was a kid?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is as long as there has been some type of media, people have always sought to control how people think. And it can go
Hmm.
all the way back to the founding of our nation and even farther back than that.
Okay.
I think it's the degree to which it's being done and the sophistication with which it's being done today that is particularly remarkable.
Hmm.
Of course, when we were younger, there were much more limited sources of news, at least online. There was no computers. There was just television, and at that time, there were only three main television stations,
True.
and that enabled a small number of people that were in control of those organizations and the key editorial team at those to really serve in that role of gatekeepers of information.
Hmm.
Though there was a much more robust print media at that time, newspapers in particular, and magazines,
Hmm.
which have fallen out of favor in our day as we've shifted online. And there's a much more robust, and there was sort of a time, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, when it was a little bit of a kind of Wild West online, and there was a democratization of information where there was still a lot of attempts to control what people thought, but then they were sort of starting in some ways to lose some of that control, as just about anybody could create their own website and start sharing information.
Hmm.
And God has used that to allow truth to be put out there. God is the one who ultimately was in control of creating electronic communications to spread the gospel around the world, the truth.
Hmm.
And God has retains that control sufficient to ensure that the truth can still be found online. But Satan has redoubled his efforts and has both put all kinds of countervailing and so much information, it's sort of data overload when you try to find what's going on online. And if people are sincere and they're praying, God can lead them to truth online and to give them discernment. But Satan is trying to put so many voices out there on the internet that it becomes harder to find the truth. There's so much distracting information that's out there. And there has been a great consolidation in the media and entertainment space. in the past 20 or so years, um, where there are fewer and fewer people who, again, are taking control of what information we're allowed to have access to.
Mm.
There's also um, in the growth, particularly of data management and also with artificial intelligence, where they are creating profiles, digital profiles of literally every single person on Earth, and they try to tightly control what information you're allowed to see, even on your social media feeds, what actually comes up on your recommendations, all the kinds of information that come up on your news feeds. That's actually very carefully tailored both to what they think you want to see and also what they want you to see.
Mm.
And it's being designed by people with ultimately often malevolent purposes, where they're trying to really, in a very sophisticated way, steer you into seeing things the way they want you to see them. And we really need help and discernment from God to really understand what's really going on. So there's God will always keep the truth available for those who sincerely want it. But Satan is becoming very sophisticated and working through powerful human organizations and people to try to control the information space, because in many ways information is power. Now, as we consider where we left off from our last, as we're going through just the headlines in the media that have been happening over the past couple of months, there's just so much we can't get into all the details of every story. Here is one that comes from the Day Star in the UK, the Daily Star. World could be ruled by trillionaires club of wealthy elite boasting 12-0 fortunes. So there are a handful of super wealthy people in this world. Uh, back over 100 years ago, when we had the robber barons of the monopolies of the late 1800s and early 1900s, the Rockefellers and the J.P. Morgans and the Carnegies, they were millionaires at that time, and that actually meant you were super wealthy. And then somewhere along the way, maybe 30 or so years ago, it became being a billionaire what you had to be in order to actually be really considered super wealthy. And today there are some of the most powerful people controlling some of the largest companies in the world that are approaching the trillionaire club. And those numbers, those words and those numbers are almost beyond our comprehension to understand. And one of the ways I've seen it to try to help us just understand just how much money $1 trillion is, because we can really hardly fathom how much it is. Here we have a search I did here. How tall is a stack of 1 million $1 bills? So if you had 1 million $1 bills, it actually would stand 358 feet tall, or about the size of a large skyscraper of 30 to 35-story building. Now that's a lot of $1 bills. But if you switch that to a billion $1 bills, just $1 billion bills, would be 67 miles high, almost 68 miles high. That would be stretching out almost into space. Um, but if you want to go all the way out to $1 trillion, $1 trillion would actually be almost 68,000 miles high and would actually stretch 1/4 of the way from the Earth to the moon. And a single person is controlling this much money now. And actually, they're approaching where multiple people are getting to where very soon they will have this much money under their control. I think most of us have probably never possessed a stack of money that what was very high at all on our desk in our room. And yet these people are controlling so much money that it literally would reach into outer space if you stacked it all up. They are, as we were, inspiration told us, they are a few men are grasping the means of power in certain lines to pile up colossal fortunes. And as the book of James tells us, these rich who are grinding down the poor as they put these fortunes together to control things for themselves. And Satan especially seeks to work through such people because of the great influence that he can have through them. And it's really where individuals are now having as much influence or even more than major governments of the entire world. And really, there's only a handful of governments in the world that actually control more money than some of these individuals. Um, our next article from CNBC, it's a major financial publication that's ultimately controlled by NBC. PayPal's crypto partner mints 300 trillion stable coins in quote technical error. So uh, again, PayPal was one of the first, really the first major digital online platform that could serve as a digital currency. Many of the most powerful tech billionaires in our day came out of that original PayPal, including, as we saw, Peter Thiel in a previous update, who's behind Vice President J.D. Vance, who controls this company Palantir that's creating a digital file on every single person in the world, uh, who is working with all of our top intelligence agency in the military, uh, who, for instance, his company provided the data to the government of Israel in who they targeted to kill and who not to kill in the Gaza war. These aren't just arbitrary uh, uh, ideas, but they're actually being used and implemented in very real ways that are affecting the lives and ending the lives of individuals on this earth. And one of those, who had created a type of crypto digital currency, which are called stable coins. Stable coins are digital currencies that are supposedly tied to actual currencies or actual physical assets to try to help maintain a stable price for that digital currency, though it's all ultimately arbitrary, that in a quote technical error, they mistakenly just out of the blue created 300 trillion of these stable coins, which is just an absurd, that's more than all the money in the world, really, in a quote mistake, which just shows how arbitrary and really not real these digital currencies are. Just like even our paper currency today is not backed by any real assets, and it's really just monopoly money that people honor as being real money. Here from MSN.com, U.S. Special Operations helicopters near Venezuela expand Caribbean mission. So again, all throughout, we'll see all throughout the Western Hemisphere, especially in Central and South America, U.S. Military assets are being mobilized that are threatening multiple nations, especially currently Venezuela, but also some of its surrounding nations like Colombia and others, and even Mexico as well, where these nations are being brought to heel to submit to the coming beast system. Trump flies B-52 bombers near Venezuela as he prepares for more strikes on drug cartels, and Maduro accuses him of a, quote, coup. That's from the Sun in the UK. So, again, the purported purpose of these military operations in the Caribbean basin are supposedly to stop drug trafficking. But we know that there are other purposes at work. Yes, drug trafficking is a serious problem, and efforts should be made to bring such things under control. But often, the way that our military and intelligence assets are used by our government is not to stop these things from happening, but they're actually to stop competitors from taking away the cartel assets that are actually under the control of our military and intelligence into agencies. And so the best way to do that is to use our government, law enforcement, and military assets to seem like they're doing something about the problem, and what really they're doing is they're consolidating and controlling these operations for their own purposes. Um, Here, the quote, "No Kings protest organizers prepare for a possible Trump crackdown. News of the United States online." So there's been, since Trump has come back to office, those on the left of the political spectrum have increased their protest activities. These have been often labeled, quote, "No Kings protests," which is interesting as we consider prophetically. This is the time for the revelation of the true king and the setting up of false kings in opposition to the true king. And we've seen how Trump has publicly presented himself as a king, and he often operates through executive orders like he is a king. And so there's some truth that we ought to be protesting against having no kings in America. We're not supposed to have kings in America. And yet these so-called protest efforts on the left of the political spectrum are actually serving a purpose to deceive more than anything, than actually truly provide a true protest. A true protest would be based on the scriptures and would be coming from Bible-believing Christians, not from people who really are in direct opposition against the law of God in every other way. But it's interesting how these protest efforts are developing, because God is trying to reach all minds, including those on the left. Here from the Mirror in the UK, opinion piece, quote, opinion piece. It's a rare article here that's actually labeled as opinion. Most of the news that we, quote, news that we receive today really is opinion pieces and no longer news. They don't even really attempt to make it seem like it's news anymore. But here, this one's at least officially labeled opinion. Donald Trump's, quote, 12 unhinged moments as he, quote, plans to launch missiles at California. So, President Trump's rhetoric in these, especially immigration raids and efforts against the so-called sanctuary cities, especially in the so-called blue states, of his perceived political enemies. He's become so frustrated at various times in their opposition that he's literally, at least, we don't know how serious is, and of course he says many things that he's really quite serious about and ends up doing. He actually has even threatened to launch missiles at cities in America if he doesn't get his way, as it were. Here from the BBC, what we know about the White House's plans for a, quote, arc to Trump. So just like in France, you have the Arc de Triomphe, which was a memorial around the World War II, or maybe it was from World War One and it was in existence in World War II. I'd have to double check the history of the Arc de Triomphe. Uh, Here, Trump was so enamored of the Arc de Triomphe when he visited France that he decided that he wants to create his own memorial here in America called the Arc. That's been at least dubbed the Arc de Trump, as he is sitting, creating these great uh, visual images of American prowess and power, similar to his current renovation works in building a large ballroom where the east wing of the White House used to stand, but was recently torn down. Here from Newsweek in America, the Civil War tearing apart college Republicans. So there is a constant political strife fomented in the media between the so-called left and the so-called right. But even within the right and within the left, there are factions that are vying for power in seemingly civil war, as it's labeled here, efforts. Again, Newsweek tends to be more of a left-leaning publication, and so it's wanting to paint the right-wing side, as it were, the Republican young people, as being involved in great strife. Whether that's really the case or not, again, we're not taking sides in these debates. We're just trying to see how things are being painted in the media. And a picture of things being in constant turmoil and 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 strife is something that is continually being put out into the media space to create stress and anxiety and fear among the populace. Here from the Wall Street Journal, Trump hosts corporate ballroom donors at a glitzy White House dinner. So this huge ballroom that Trump is building at the White House is supposedly not using any government funds to do it, but he's actually receiving large, uh, primarily corporate and private donations, but which, of course, those donations are ultimately, unlike traditional political donations, there are no restrictions on those donations, and yet they curry great favor with the current political class. So if you want to have some positive influence with President Trump, you can give a multi-million-dollar donation to help support the building of the new White House ballroom. And here is about a fancy dinner that they were having at the White House for many of those who have already made such donations. And we've looked a little bit at this before here from Variety.com. The Age of Disclosure UFO documentary gets a release date and released a trailer. Again, this is from back a month or so ago, this particular article. The documentary actually has since been released on Amazon Prime, I think on November 20th, I believe, if I remember correctly. It was released where you still had to pay for it. It wasn't released for free. You had to pay something like $20 or $25 to either rent or buy this documentary so far. I imagine at some point it will become available at a reduced cost or for free in the future. Whoever made this, those behind the making of this documentary are seeking to, at a minimum, recoup their costs of making the documentary, and so it's only on a pay-per-view access, as it were, at the moment. But many details of the documentary, again, have been released. And again, there's at least 35 very high-level, powerful, legitimate political leaders, in the executive branch, in our intelligence agencies, in our military, both current and former, sitting senators, sitting representatives in the House, the current Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, the former head of the National Security Agency. These are not nobodies or tinfoil hat crackpots, as they like to label people who traditionally believed in such things. These are very powerful people that are in a position to know what's going on in the government, who are now coming out and saying that the government secretly, behind the scenes, has been meeting and communing with entities that are not of this earth, and that they've been doing so for at least 80 years, which would go back to the end of World War II. Of course, with spiritual discernment and insight, we understand they're actually communing with demons. And the demons are the ones that are telling them what to do. And again, we discussed how for these things there has been an aura created around it where traditionally these things have supposedly been covered up and only occasionally a few details are leaked to the public, that these things are supposedly going on behind the scenes to create a mystery around it. But now the tables are being turned and the disclosure is coming out, and it's happening in a way to deceive people about what's really happening and about the true nature of these entities in which they are communing. It's also connected to these orb lights and so-called UFOs or UAPs that we read about in the news increasingly. That one was from, again, Variety.com. There's a similar article here in People.com. Here's another similar article from Deadline.com. So those are three of the top entertainment insider publications in the mainstream media space: Variety, People, and Deadline.com. If you are in the entertainment industry, these are some of the key publications that you go to know what's going on in the entertainment industry. And suddenly, the idea that there are intelligence from other parts of the universe that actually exist and are in communication with human beings is becoming a very, quote, mainstream idea that's being brought out to the front. And again, I believe that's absolutely psychological conditioning, preparing people for Satan to appear as an angel of light, to deceive the world. Here from Yahoo.com, CEO warns of, quote, black swan event under Trump. So a major financial industry CEO, very powerful person, has come out here. A black swan event, again, is an event that is something that is part of the, quote, unknown unknown. So there are things that are known, there are things that are unknown, but that you can know something about the unknown through probability. And then there are those things that are considered to be unknown unknowns that are just completely unpredictable. And they're often referred to as being called here colloquially black swan events, which goes back to the idea that for hundreds of years it was believed that there were only white swans in the world, until it was discovered in the southern hemisphere, I believe, around Australia and New Zealand, that there actually are black swans. And that overturned a belief that was thought to be known for sure for hundreds of years, that there only are white swans. And so these unpredictable events, in a financial sense, of a catastrophic event, are referred to as a black swan event. And here's a major financial CEO saying that he's predicting that one is going to happen under President Trump in his current administration. Very interesting. I wonder how he knows that. Here from the Daily Mail in the UK, mysterious spy balloons appearing over several US states spark fears of a covert invasion. So just like there was that Chinese spy balloon incident a few years ago under President Biden, apparently more mysterious, quote, spy balloons of unknown origin are appearing frequently over US states. And interestingly, most frequently, they're appearing over US military installations, which one might argue is, again, part of these preparations for war. Again, here from CNBC, the major financial arm of NBC News, regional banks, Jefferies, shares tank as concerns about sour loans grow on Wall Street. So regional banks are not the major too big to fail banks, but the still substantial but smaller regional banks. And this also Jefferies, which is a major financial firm, all of their financial shares have been doing quite poorly, according to this article. And it's a sign that the investment bank loan environment is souring, which is a precursor financial sign that the economy is on the verge of a great downturn, which is again something that we're prophetically expecting to happen soon and will be used as an excuse ultimately to bring in a digital currency so that they can much more easily implement a system of no buy, no sell in the financial world. Here from MSN.com, at the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, who's the Fed Bank chairman, may have just given stock investors a new reason to be worried. So even the top head of the Federal Reserve Bank, which controls interest rates in America and has tremendous, powerful financial influence, and which is actually ultimately a private bank, not a public bank, despite the name and the appearance, is putting out subtle information to prepare people to expect a financial calamity to be coming soon. Here from the Wall Street Journal, Chinese spy scandal that is rocking Britain's government. So there has been increasing scandals in the British government on a variety of fronts, and here's another one that supposedly were some major infiltration by alleged Chinese spies. And how much of these things are really so? How much is it propaganda that's massaging what people think about these things? We're not getting into the details of that. We're just looking about how they're putting these things out into the public, which is constantly creating a continual sense of anxiety and stress and fear and suggesting that we are on the verge of a major war. Here from the AP News, Smartmatic executives charged with alleged bribery in the Philippines. So Smartmatic is one of the major makers of voting machines, the electronic voting machines that there were allegations, especially by supporters of President Trump in the 2020 election, that these machines were involved in voter fraud. There are several different major voting machine companies, but Smartmatic actually is the one that designs the software that really controls nearly all of even the other physical machines that are sometimes made by other companies. And there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that that original software was actually written by the CIA itself with the very purpose of actually fixing elections in, of all interesting countries, Venezuela, where President Trump has suddenly become somewhat obsessed with. Um, and now these machines are being used supposedly to count votes in America. And there are at least allegations that they are being used in nefarious ways to undermine the legitimacy of elections here in America. And here is an article that comes out that these executives actually are being charged by major governments that they were involved in receiving bribes from the government of the Philippines in order to actually fix elections there. So, giving credence to the idea that these machines actually can be used to fix elections, even though that was actually claimed publicly by all of the major media sources to not at all be possible. But it clearly is possible since our government itself is actually charging these executives with committing fraud. Here from ProPublica.com, immigration agents have held more than 170 Americans against their will. So, and again, this is probably at least a month old or so, this particular article. That is part of these ICE raids and immigration raids all across America, supposedly targeting illegal immigrants and non-citizens for having come to America illegally or having overstayed their initial legal entry. That it is not just picking up illegal immigrants, but that it is actually picking up U.S. citizens at a minimum as of the writing of this article, 170 actual U.S. citizens who were swept up in these raids. I'm sure the true number is probably much larger. And that seems to not matter that their constitutional rights are being violated. And it just seems to be being written off as the cost of doing business to somehow deal with the immigration problem. Even though that's, of course, completely illegal and unconstitutional. Here from the Mirror in the UK, the Buckingham Palace makes major King Charles announcement about historic moment in days. So I don't actually remember the details of that article, but Buckingham Palace, of course, is the main residence of the king or queen in England. I believe that ultimately, oh, here it is, yes, in the next article, it was actually related to this idea, here's from the Telegraph in the UK, that the King Charles became the first British monarch to pray in public with the Pope in over 500 years. So kings and queens in Britain have since the time of the Reformation and the time of the split between the Church of England and the Church of Rome, not publicly entered into an alliance or public prayer in this particular instance with the Pope as a consequence of that split in 500 years, even though there have been some British kings and queens who have been sympathetic with the papacy and some who were true Protestants who are truly in opposition to the papacy. But here, those barriers are being broken down, and the wayward daughters are being brought back under the fold of the harlot mother. And King Charles did actually publicly pray with the Pope in Rome last month, and also was given a special, quote, chair, a permanent chair in a powerful church near the Vatican as a reward for his fealty to the Pope. Here from the Irish Star, RFK Jr., that's Robert F. Kennedy Jr., he's the Health and Human Services Secretary under President Trump, uses his platform during the Trump event to go on a rant about teenagers' sperm. So there's a dramatic drop in fertility in Western nations for a variety of reasons, but tremendously related to the contamination of our food and our water and our air with harmful chemicals and hormone disrupting chemicals. And RFK Jr. is using his platform as the head of the Health and Human Services to bring these things out into the public square to be discussed, that something needs to be done about it. This particular article seems to be putting it out there in sort of a negative way that he had something to say about this, but I think there's some legitimacy to the concern that he's putting out there. I don't necessarily agree with everything that he does and all the ways that he's doing it, but there are many things about RFK Jr.'s agenda to try to clean up our food supply that we can actually support as Bible-believing Christians. And here's an article from barons.com. That's a kind of kind of more feature-length magazine publication connected with the Wall Street Journal. And it says wetware, quote, wetware, scientists using human mini brains to power computers. So scientists are actually growing clumps of neurons of human origin, creating what they're describing here as mini brains, and then using them to try to connect to computer systems and increase the computing power of modern computer systems in some sort of bizarre dystopian uh, effort to combine humans and machines, which is one of Satan's great deceptions in this world, that somehow we're evolving to a higher level of intelligence and that humans can somehow control such things in a way that's beneficial, even though it's in direct opposition to what God would have done. Here from Bloomberg.com, U.S. auto delinquencies are 50% higher than they were 15 years ago. So, in a sign that the U.S. economy is not doing as well as they often try to paint in the traditional financial press, the true issue is that people are falling behind on their bills, and here in particular on the major expense of auto payments are at 50% higher. That's a huge number. An increase of 5 to 10% would be considered substantial, but here they're up 50%, showing that many people are struggling to get by just to pay their even basic day-to-day bills. Here also from the Irish Star, House Oversight Committee investigating Trump's controversial $200 million White House ballroom. So another article about the ballroom and where is the money coming from. And again, it's being paid for by private and corporate donors. And what influence is that buying them with the government? Here from the Metro in the UK, damning messages between young Republicans speak of gas chambers and rape. So much of the online rhetoric that goes on in this world is very disturbing and getting darker and darker. And increasingly, young people who don't have a memory of the horrors of the 20th century are giving in to rhetoric online that has echoes of the persecutions of World War II with gas chambers here. And even some people discuss things like rape in an open way as something that's acceptable or could be used as part of a military tactic, for instance. to demoralize the society. Here from the Atlantic.com, the depth of MAGA's moral collapse. MAGA being Trump's Make America Great Again effort. And here's an article from the Atlantic, again, a more left-leaning publication that is professing to point to many of the moral failings of the so-called right politically, whose entire public face is somehow designed to allegedly have the purpose of bringing morality back into the public sphere. But this article is pointing out the inconsistencies that really many of the people who are the public face of this movement themselves are doing many questionable moral things in their personal lives and in their professional lives. Because they're not neither side, left or right, is really following the ways of the scriptures. Here again from CNBC.com, NBC's financial arm, Trump states Kremlin's Russia-Alaska tunnel pitch to Musk is, quote, interesting. So at the Russia American summit that happened in Alaska this past fall, where Trump and Putin met, Elon Musk was apparently also involved, and the Kremlin, through Putin, proposed that an underground tunnel be dug between Russia and Alaska. And President Trump is suggesting here that perhaps that's an interesting idea that we should pursue. Certainly going back to the Cold War days, that would have been an absolute non-starter and would have been considered as a means by which military assets could be delivered surreptitiously between the two nations in a sneak attack. But suddenly now, to promote business, this seems to be being put out there as a potentially legitimate idea that's being given consideration. Here from NPR.org, that's National Public Radio. A classified satellite network is emitting a mysterious signal. So there's a major, there are many, many different satellite networks in space. There are many thousands, and I think at this point, tens of thousands of satellites in orbit around our planet. And here, a particularly classified government network is emitting some strange signal that is drawing attention. And again, there's whether this is a true signal, whether it's purposely being put out there as part of some deception. We don't know the true ideas about it, but it's just interesting that such things are happening and attention is being called to them. Here from ProPublica, how Trump is building a violent, shadowy federal police force. So speaking about the ICE raids and the immigration structures that are being built up, where this federal police force that is fully funded to the tune of tens of billions of dollars, as much as some entire armies in this world of entire governments, is being outfitted, armed, logistically, heavily armed, and they are being allowed to operate with near impunity to go around America and to round up people at gunpoint, often in the middle of the night, and take people away to camps, which have been set up in nearly every state in our nation at this point. And we've seen is not just rounding up illegal immigrants, but is actually, at this point, already beginning to round up U.S. citizens, and is putting in place a system that logistically could at any time in the future be shifted to another purpose, including the purpose of rounding up Bible-believing Christians when that time comes. And again, that was fully funded by President Trump's so-called big, beautiful bill this past summer. Here, excuse me, here from the Free Beacon, covert action from cover to cover, exposing some of the covert action that's happening around the world and the ways in which things behind the scenes are happening, which aren't always obvious to the public, and that alternative motives are often behind what is put forth publicly as the reasons why certain things are happening in the news. Here's an article from the New York Times about Jeffrey Epstein. There's been, of course, a lot of news about Jeffrey Epstein and his connections to rich and the powerful in this world in the past few months. And here's one of those articles along those lines in the New York Times about him and his communications with this particular billionaire, Leon Black, who's a major corporate raider and financial investor. And this Jeffrey Epstein was connected in with the probably the majority of some of the most powerful people in the world in finance, in technology, in medicine, in business, in governments, in intelligence agencies. And how does someone of such a questionable moral character seem to be moving in these circles so freely? This is just one of many, many articles along those lines that has appeared in the news recently. Because everything that's done in secret, we're told, will be brought abroad before the end. And many of these things are being exposed right now. And then also there are major efforts being undertaken to try to confuse people about that so that they don't truly understand. Here from Newsweek.com, how a Russian invasion of NATO might play out. So here again from Newsweek, a major magazine publication in America is literally just putting out the psychological operation of propaganda to put it in the minds of people that we need to be thinking about how a war with Russia will play out. And specifically, they're saying a Russian invasion of NATO, as if Russia is somehow spending all of its time planning how it might invade Western nations, which I
Can
don't
I
think.
ever ask you a question after the
Sure,
meeting?
sure, sister, no problem.
I might have asked you before, but I forgot.
Okay, that's fine. Um, yeah, from MSN.com, the rise of shadow banking brings new financial risks, experts say. So, an increasingly large amount of financial activity, a very large, significant percentage of financial activity today is actually happening through the quote shadow banking system, which is outside the traditional banking system and thus is not subject to the traditional regulatory checks and balances and is purportedly creating new financial risks to the system. Of course, the article sort of ignores the idea that the traditional system itself, despite its supposed regulatory checks and balances, is itself creating tremendous financial risk because of regulatory capture, where the very agencies that are been created to supposedly regulate these major financial institutions are actually controlled by those institutions themselves through various means and financial donations and a revolving door of personnel going back and forth between the government and the private sector.
To re-record, press 2.
We can hear you, sister, so you need to mute.
Sorry about that.
To continue recording where you left off, press 4.
And here, in a similar line, Telegraph in the UK, world's banking system risks a $4.5 trillion shock from the shadows. Again, pointing to this idea that there's this shadowy system of private financial activity that's happening that is placing the whole system at risk. Which, again, on some level is partly true, and on another level is actually distracting from the fact that the entire system is built on a house of cards and basically a system of financial fraud, because the fiat money system is not based on sound money. And that idea is really largely ignored in most of the financial press. Here, getting back to these No Kings protests pass in festival atmosphere as an estimated 7 million across the U.S. rally against Trump's, quote, authoritarianism. This is from The Independent in the UK. So these protests have been continuing. They allegedly are reaching into the millions. Whether that's true or not, we can't say for sure, but they are substantial. You can drive over many overpasses just about anywhere and see these protests happening on a small scale, at least. And but they're also having these strange kind of carnival festival atmosphere connected with them, because it's really not the Spirit of God that's behind them. And yet they're protesting a legitimate concern, which is the growing authoritarianism in our country. I think they're more what we would describe as controlled opposition. Here from the Sun in the UK, Trump and Zelensky in second White House shouting match after Don urged him to accept Putin's terms to end the Ukraine war. So there continues to be a great back and forth and a lot of tension between the West, especially President Trump, and President Zelensky in Ukraine, and also the tension between the West and NATO and with Russia over what's happening in Ukraine. And there's much machinations behind the scenes and efforts and manipulations by intelligence agencies and Vatican agents and many other things happening that aren't what's seen in public. But here is this at least public outburst of seemingly strife and disagreement, adding to the tension in the public sphere. Here is just a curious article from the Telegraph in the UK. Pete Hegseth, who again is the Secretary of War or the Secretary of Defense, either way how you look at it, and he wore a tie that has caused an uproar in diplomatic circles, because the tie actually was really just, it's the colors of America. It was red, white, and blue, but they claimed that they were in the appearance and order that those same colors appear in the Russian flag. And it created quite a diplomatic uproar.
You're kidding, aren't you?
No, this is a real article. That was from, again, from the Telegraph in the UK. And it was much talked about that seemingly the head of our entire military here in America was wearing a tie that looked like, sort of like a Russian flag. And of course, famously, just a few months ago, there was a video put out of a Russian tank that was on the march in Ukraine, and it was flying on one side of its tank, it had the Russian flag, and on the other side of its tank, it had the American flag as it was going into battle against Ukraine. Um, Again, whether that was done with full approval of the military in those areas, or whether that was just some propaganda effort, again, we don't know the truth behind these things, but these are interesting things that are being put out into the public sphere for our consumption. I hear from the New York Times, supposedly, at least used to be known as the publication of record here in America. I think they have been discredited in many ways from that title in our day, but here, gold bars, gold necklaces, and gold earrings, the rush to cash in. So, because of all the financial uncertainty, we've seen in a previous update how the spot price of gold in the commodities market has ballooned to its highest level ever, over $4,000 an ounce. And many people are cashing in their private stocks of gold in such things as necklaces and earrings to try to take advantage. But really, they're taking their valuable commodity, which is inflation resistant, and trading it in for Federal Reserve notes, which have nothing real to back them up. And it's also leading to a consolidation and a shift of the private gold market into the public space, which will ultimately give more control to the powers that be in the financial world to control our financial assets, which of course is really the point of what they want to do, because they want to be able to implement a system of no buy, no sell, where there are not private financial assets that aren't under their control. Here, straight from the Catholic News Agency, Pope Leo XIV canonizes 7 new saints, including the first from, interesting, Venezuela and one from Papua New Guinea. So the new pope, same as the old popes, he's no different from all the popes that came along. He thinks he has the right to tell us who a saint is and who a saint isn't, and that he has the right to canonize new saints. Interesting, number 7 is the new number of saints he's canonized, as we've had our prophetic studies on the number 7. And even the countries that are especially emphasized here, Venezuela, the one that's become this flashpoint for a potential military conflict here in the Western Hemisphere. And the other one is also very interesting, Papua New Guinea. That's where the probably largest evangelistic series in modern Adventist history recently concluded, where I believe some crazy number like 300,000 people were baptized, something like that, recently. How legitimate these baptisms were, how much they really understood and accepted our doctrines and the truth of the scriptures, we won't get into all that at this moment, but the effort to paint the picture that somehow our church is growing by leaps and bounds, and that's evidence that the Holy Spirit is blessing us despite the fact that we're in such open rebellion against God in so many other ways, is an effort that's being put out there by our Adventist leaders. And at the same time, the Catholic Church is canonizing a new saint from the same place. Very interesting to me. I hear from this kind of news conglomeration website that puts out news headlines from many different media sources, DNYUZ. America's nuke watchdog running on skeleton crew for the shutdown. So we have the longest government shutdown in American history. in October and into November. And many things were written about that, purported about that. This one article is from October 20th. And there was the claim that the nuclear watchdog had to run on a skeleton crew as a consequence of the government shutdown. How much of that was really the case? How much did that meant that we were actually in any danger at all? We can't comment on. Again, it's still just putting out the mindset that everything is in chaos and we should be in fear that this is going to lead to a calamity or collapse. Here from CNBC, AWS, that's Amazon Web Services outage takes major websites dark. What we know as recovery begins. So that's there's been actually several recent major outages by these major server farms that enable all of our internet connections with the major websites and financial transactions that we do online happen through these huge server farms that are controlled by a handful of corporations and then are rented out access and space on them to all of the major corporations in our country and around the world that enable our online transactions. By far the biggest one of those is Amazon Web Services. I think it controls as much as maybe 70% of that market, and it's had some major outages that have mysteriously caused our access with many websites to just suddenly shut down. It also shows how easily just targeting a few key companies and a few key network nodes can actually bring down major aspects of the internet all at once. And the vulnerability that really exists to our online networks and also to our online economy, which originally was supposed to be to make us more distributed and less vulnerable. It's actually at this point making us more vulnerable. Yes, Brother Chris?
I was just wondering, do you think those were just tests to see if it was if it was easy to just shut down so we couldn't buy and sell in the future if they were just testing it? Do you think it was
That's
possibly
certainly
that?
that's certainly one possibility, brother. And I certainly think that's even a likely possibility.
Okay.
So there are whole nations, such as Singapore and others, that have supposedly set up internet kill switches, where when they don't want information or there's information spreading virally that they don't want going on, that they can just essentially flip a switch and shut everything down.
Mhm.
And no such official authorization for the creation of such a thing in America has ever been created, but these are sort of backdoor ways where they could essentially do the same thing, and they could be testing out how to do that. This could be foreign agents of state governments that are hostile to us. This could be insiders within our own government doing it. It could be other forces that we aren't directly aware of who's doing it. But it is interesting how these things are happening. Here from Axios.com, hunting stand with sightline of Trump's Air Force One in Florida found. So back in October, here again, October 20th, 2025, one of the locations in Florida that President Trump frequents as he goes to visit Mar-a-Lago in Florida, where Air Force One lands, supposedly a hunting stand that had a line of sight to where the plane lands was found in the brush and woods around that area by the FBI. Whether that was something that was actually placing President Trump in possible danger of assassination, or whether it was just someone who set up a hunting stand to actually just do some hunting in the woods, and it just happened to be there, or whether powers within the government are trying to make President Trump feel threatened. We don't know what's really behind these things. These are just interesting things that are coming out in the media. Here's another article from MSN.com on the same issue. Here from the Times.com, meet the young Americans who want a monarchy, but not, quote, King Trump. So there are young people who don't like that President Trump is acting so authoritarian and his particular policies, but who are actually suddenly coming out publicly that they don't really like the fact that we have a constitutional republic or with democratic principles, but they want to turn America into a monarchy where in the future we could have a king. Very interesting. These young people who knew nothing of our history and how our founding fathers rejected the idea of having a king or having a pope.
Mhm.
And that knowledge is rapidly being lost by those who have been raised in our modern educational system that really comes from the World Core curriculum and Lucis Trust at the United Nations, preparing the way for Satan's kingdom on earth to be set up. Here from Barron's.com, Khamenei, that's in Iran, the supreme leader of Iran, Khamenei tells Trump to, quote, keep dreaming over claims of destroying Iran's nuclear sites. So back in June of this year, Israel launched a series of attacks and raids on Iran's nuclear facilities. Ultimately, President Trump decided to join those attacks and to especially use so-called American bunker buster bombs to try to really, quote, take out Iran's deep underground nuclear facilities. Trump claimed immediately after that they had been completely obliterated, and now the supreme leader in the Islamic theocracy in Iran is claiming that Trump is delusional in that claim and that no real significant damage was happened to their nuclear facilities. Again, we don't know which claim is true or if it's somewhere in between. But these are interesting developments in the news and could even be used as an excuse to actually justify launching more attacks, which could lead to a broader war. Here, again, interesting here from Yahoo.com, Trump posts an AI video of himself flying, quote, King Trump jet and bombing protesters with a, quote, brown liquid, which that brown liquid was something that allegedly typically comes out of the backside of human beings. And President Trump publicly posted this video created by AI of him flying this jet, which was labeled on the side King Trump, which he apparently envisions himself as, and that he took some joy in the thought that he could spread fecal matter all over his opponents politically. Really, really strange times in which we live. Here from MSN.com, White House begins demolishing the East Wing facade to build Trump's ballroom. So the whole East Wing of the White House has been completely demolished. And President Trump is moving forward with building his big, beautiful ballroom with these $200 million in donations from corporate donors who are seeking to gain influence in the White House. Here from Breitbart.com, this is more of a so-called right-wing publication. Chicago area judge rules ICE can be arrested at courthouses. So in these sanctuary, so-called sanctuary cities in democratic controlled blue states, as it were. Here, Chicago being a major one in Illinois. A judge there made a ruling that the federal government agents from Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or so-called ICE, can be arrested if they come to try to round up immigrants at courthouses in Illinois, creating this tension and possibility of conflict between state and federal government agents. All, again, fomenting strife and tension, and the mindset also that not only might World War be coming, but Civil War might be coming in America. And of course, inspiration tells us that we should probably expect both, ultimately, before the end. And they're preparing to bring that to pass. Here from MSN.com, Marines investigating errant, quote, live fire blast over California's I-5. So I-5 is one of the major freeways in California. I think Southern California, maybe it's Northern California, I'm not sure in this particular instance. But the military, the Marines in particular, were doing some live fire exercises, and somehow some of that live fire ordnance went right up and over a major highway where civilians are driving by all day long in very large numbers. And apparently there's an investigation into how that happened. President here from, also from MSN, Trump, who's age 79 apparently now, posts menacing video of a never-ending presidency. So again, President Trump posted publicly an AI-generated video that began saying not only has he had his first term from 2016 to 2020, and then now he's in his second term that goes from 2024 to 2028, but then it showed a picture of him supposedly winning an election in 2028, and then 2032, and then 2036, and it kept going and going and going into the future, faster and faster and faster in the video, as if he could just keep getting reelected forever. Quote, reelected, even though that itself violates the Constitution. But he has no problem putting things out into the public mindset to think that we should expect him to be around forever, because he thinks of himself as a king who can rule for the rest of his life. Here from the Atlantic.com, the risks of Trump's capture of the economy. So again, this is a more left-leaning publication in opposition to President Trump, and it's talking about how the federal government is been moving under President Trump to take control and even direct investments in certain aspects of the economy. Of course, it ignores the idea that this has been happening under all administrations for decades at various levels, but it's pointing to the more recent developments under President Trump in this regard, as if somehow they are opposing some greater threat than the fact that this has been actually happening on an escalating scale for a very long time under both Republican and Democratic administrations. Here's a online blogger, Ken Klippenstein's No Kings is About More Than Trump. We're getting into the some of the details about these protests and what it really means. That our leaders are increasingly authoritarian and just simply doing what they want in opposition to the Constitution and our written laws. Which again, inspiration told us that before the end, as the time came for the Sunday law to be implemented, that we would abrogate every Republican and Protestant principle of our Constitution. Again, there, Republican doesn't mean Republican in the sense of the political party, but Republican in the sense of a republic that is a limited constitutional system that has special protections for minority rights. Here from MSN.com, Ted Cruz begs GOP to take political peril seriously after furious anti-Trump protests. So Ted Cruz is certainly on the so-called conservative side of things politically, and yet major voices are sounding the alarm that the backlash to some of the things that Trump is doing is creating political baggage for those in the Republican Party. Now, Ted Cruz himself is no saint and is famous. Him and his father actually are part of the so-called Seven Mountain Dominion movement that says we have to take back every major structure in society for Jesus and to make us an official Christian nation where church and state can be united. So we can take with a grain of salt his concerns here. And yet even voices like him are voicing concerns about some of the developments that are happening in the Trump administration. Here from MSN.com, exclusive wide-ranging group of U.S. officials pursues Trump's fight against the, quote, deep state. So, of course, in Trump's first administration, he had many plans of what he wanted to accomplish, and at least supposedly, publicly, it is purported that there were elements within the government itself, the so-called deep state, that actually constantly worked in direct opposition to what President Trump was trying to accomplish as the president and head of the executive branch. Of course, there's some truth to that. There is a deep state. It's actually controlled by Vatican agents and is doing many things that are in opposition to what the U.S. people want and vote for in our elections. But also, at the same time, that is now being used by President Trump as an excuse to himself undermine constitutional protections in order to take the steps necessary to root out these deep state elements. So it's kind of heads I win, tails you lose. Either way, the American people and our constitutional freedoms are being broken down, and the people are losing our rights, our civil and religious liberties rapidly. MSN.com, Poland warns Russia's Putin against crossing its airspace for Trump summit. So Russia, as Putin and President Trump were planning to have a summit, I forget exactly where, on European soil, and apparently the shortest route for President Putin to attend that would be to fly over some small portion of Polish airspace. And Poland here felt it necessary to publicly warn President Putin against doing so. But what exactly Poland could do if he actually did that, and if they actually did anything about that, would it not actually provoke a military and response and declaration of war against Poland? These are interesting developments. Just about out of time here. We'll do a few more. New York Times, Trump said to demand Justice Department pay him $230 million for past cases. So because of the way that certain elements of the federal government were sort of weaponized against President Trump during his first term and in between his two administrations under the Biden administration, President Trump now claims that in order to be made whole for all that he has suffered in his mind, our government, through the Justice Department, actually needs to pay him $230 million. And he's actually ordered the top people in charge of the Justice Department to take steps to see that this is done. Which,
Is he sane or no?
um, I think he's both does many things that seem insane, and whether that is because he's unstable or because he wants to appear that way is a good question. I think he's having a lot of demonic help, and I think there's a method to his so-called madness. And again, all of these things are both being used to destabilize our society because it's the papal motto to bring order out of chaos. So you have to create chaos if you want to bring out a different order, a new world order, as it were. And at the same time, President Trump has no problem seeking to enrich himself in the process. Here from thefederalist.com, House Committee refers John Brennan to the DOJ for prosecution. This is along the many lines of the people that really, in many ways, did misuse government resources to politically persecute President Trump in a way that was inappropriate. Not that President Trump was innocent in all the things that he did in the past, but the government shouldn't have been used in a political way against him the way it was. And now he's doing sort of the exact same thing in reverse to persecute and prosecute those who supposedly did this to him. Now, in some ways, these people should be held accountable for what they did, but actually, President Trump, in many ways, is just making the problem worse in his thirst for retribution against his perceived opponents. Here from Yahoo News in Canada, Arizona sues U.S. House over delay in swearing in Democrat Grijalva. So a Democratic representative, Congresswoman, won a special election in Arizona, and because of the government shutdown, the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, refused to swear her in until the government shutdown was over. But it also just happened to be the case that she had pledged to be the final vote necessary to compel the government to release all of the Epstein files. So there were interesting political dynamics in that seeming constitutional crisis, which has since been resolved. She has, since the government shutdown ended, she was sworn in, and she did give that vote. But of course, the release of those files has created so many loopholes, including national security concerns, that we'll actually never really see all of those files ever in a legitimate way. All right, for time's sake, we need to probably stop there. We'll pick it up in our next study. We'll probably maybe have one or two more of these updates, and then we'll get back to our studies, prophetic studies on the four winds throughout Scripture and how they connect with the sixth trumpet in Revelation chapter 9. Here, let's pray. Heavenly Father, our most holy Creator God, We thank you so much that you have helped us to go through just some of the things that are happening in this world. And again, all of these updates that we've had recently, I think this is now our sixth or seventh one, are all just news headlines from just the past roughly 2 months. And we are simply trying to see the scale of acceleration in developments in this world that are rushing us headlong toward the final crisis, which we believe is imminent in the next coming upon us in the next few months as we head to the final crisis and the final 3.5 years or 1,260 days of revelation that have been prophetically spoken of, lo, these many years. Help us to have discernment. Help us to be not caught up in the political dynamics of left or right, which both of which are a deception, and help us to recognize how the enemy is manipulating minds in order, through the tension of thesis and antithesis, to bring us to the synthesis of his final satanic kingdom. And that we might not be deceived and that we might help to undeceive others. And thank you for loving us. Thank you for teaching us and helping us and protecting us. And keep and preserve us until we can meet again, as our prayer. May it be in Jesus' name. Amen and amen.
Amen.